This system has led to wars. Several wars of recent times, from Libya to Iraq, have been at least partly a result of the fact that the rulers of these countries were exploring ways of leaving the dollar system, which they knew was not in the interest of the countries which they were leading. Let's focus on what I really want to talk about today, the internal contradictions of the dollar system. So first of all, the idea that national currencies can be world currencies is very problematic. First of all, domestically, even in the days when you had bullion and so on, gold and silver coins and so on, precious metal coins in the old times derived their value not from the metal content, but from the sovereign who minted these coins. That's why you always had these heads of sovereigns on these coins. The sovereign that minted them and promised to exchange them for the metal at face value. Because of course with circulating coins there was always wear and tear, people would clip coins and so on. So it was never assured that a given coin would actually contain the amount of precious metal that it was supposed to create. This therefore already contained the potential that in the future they would be replaced by paper money. Hence of course the Chinese genius in actually using and experimenting with paper money eons ago, centuries ago, millennia ago I think. Secondly, internationally, since there is no world state, this is the important thing one has to understand. And I would argue there cannot be a world state in capitalism. There is no world money. And that is why, classically, in the 19th century, for example, only commodities like gold in the bullion form, not in coin form, worked as money. So national currencies can serve as world money only briefly and only through exceptional contrivances. So let's look at how the sterling became world money. The short answer to understanding this is to understand that sterling was not a national currency, it was an imperial currency. What do I mean by that? In the sterling system, which existed from the late 19th century until the First World War, and it was called the gold exchange standard because sterling was backed by gold, but the currency that was circulated was sterling in paper and so on. So in the sterling gold exchange standards, pounds could be, but nearly never were exchanged for gold. People just assumed that you could exchange, and that assumption held. It held because the Bank of England made sure that it would hold. So gold's price was only the benchmark of sterling's value. Indeed, the Bank of England actually operated the gold standard with very little gold. And it did so because on the one hand, she was an international creditor. The Bank of England essentially, and Britain generally, was a creditor to the rest of the world. That's one part. And secondly, her peculiar financial system, which was very short-termist and based on providing short-term commercial and rentier types of credit. So very important, not productive. It was diametrically opposed to the industrializers that challenged Britain, and these challenger systems like Germany, the German financial system was based at that time on providing long-term patient capital for industrial development. Britain's financial system was, by contrast, responsible for her industrial decline after 1870. Britain never reconfigured her financial system into a form that would actually aid her industrial recovery. The funds that Britain turned into her favored capital exports that provided the world with sterling liquidity were extracted from her non-settler colonies. Colonies like British India, Caribbean, Africa. And British India was here preeminent, and no wonder British India was called the jewel in the crown. Britain extracted from British India home charges, gifts, and outright confiscated sterling surpluses that India earned as a result of being the second largest exporting economy in that time behind the United States. Indian Indian economy never benefited from these. These capital exports went primarily, so Britain expropriated the surpluses and then exported them as capital to Europe and to Britain's settler colonies and the United States. So Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which is the reason why these countries experienced the most powerful spurt of industrialization during this period. And in fact, Keynes points out, how did the Bank of England operate the gold standard with barely any gold? He said the Bank of England held less gold than the central bank of any other first-class power. But despite that, it still met its international engagements with promptness and certainty, which is why sterling was as good as gold, and few people demanded that sterling be exchanged for gold. And it was able to do this with promptness and certainty thanks to the efficient working of Britain's front line of defense, her international creditor position and her short-termist financial sector. Put together, they permitted Britain to counter gold claims for immediate payment with counterbalancing claims for equally immediate payments. If other people wanted money from Britain, Britain could demand money from other people on a short-term basis simply by raising the bank rate. The London money market was prompted to reduce international lending below the claims falling due. Remember, you cannot do this in a system of long-term finance. You can only do this in a system which is geared towards short-term finance. So, just to put it in a figurative form, you see the blue arrows, money flowing from the Caribbean, from Africa, from British India to England, and in the form of surpluses extracted, and then flowing outwards to North America, to Southern Africa, to Australia, to the Antipodes, and to Europe. And these were the financial flows that were the secret of the functioning of the sterling system, and that is why sterling was an instance of an imperial currency, not a national currency, serving as world money. And remember, British India at that time contained both Pakistan and Bangladesh as well as present-day India. While a book on Indian currency and finance written by Keynes in 1913 could be widely regarded as a primer of the gold standard, without British India the gold standard could not have worked. Even with such imperial advantages, sterling had difficulties. Domestically, the increasingly organized working class resisted the periodic adjustments of high interest rates that the system needed, which directly led to decreases in wages and employment. Internationally, rival powers like Germany linked to gold in order to make their own currencies widely acceptable and therefore pose a challenge to sterling. And the gold standard was only sporadically and opportunistically used by other countries. The idea that everybody was sort of joined the gold standard and remained in it for good, for at least throughout this period, is not true. Finally, Britain's capital exports had nothing to do with her industrial prowess. Indeed, they marked her industrial decline. And if you read Indian currency and finance, it's practically a love letter to the sterling system. So look at how beautifully it operates. You just tweak a little bit here and a little bit there, and everything comes out beautifully and so on. And it's only after he realized what the functioning of the sterling standard was doing to the British economy that he became increasingly a critic of the gold standard. And I wish that the United States were lucky enough to have economists like Keynes who can see what damage the operation of a similar system since the early 70s has been doing to the US economy. So why do we talk of the dollar succeeding sterling? It was at best, I would argue, a non-system. We talked of bipolarity, of course, in the post-Second World War period, Soviet Union, but and communism at that time subtracted a vast swath of the world's economy and peoples. The entire world from Prague to Pyongyang was communist. So it's pretty big, so it was definitely bipolar, but it was also multipolar because although people today think that, the US easily dominated Europe and Japan, this is actually not so. There were important tensions in those relationships. So in this already multipolar world, without an empire, things could only be worse for the US dollar. It is ironic that it was the weakening of the sterling system that prompted, on the one hand, US ruling classes to aspire to replace the sterling system with a dollar system, but on the other hand, signified the working of factors, the weakening of imperialism, as signified by communism and decolonization, that would ensure that the dollar system would never be stable, it would always be unstable. Without vast tribute-paying colonies, the US could never export substantial amounts of capital. It never did. The alternative method of providing the world with liquidity was to run deficits, and this was subject to the Triffin dilemma. First articulated by the Belgian economist Robert Triffin, testifying before Congress in 1960, he said that essentially there was a contradiction in the dollar system, which was contingent on the fact that a national currency is playing the role of an international currency. He says a sustained flow of dollars and liquidity fueling global trade implied continuous and persistent deficits in the US, consequently eroding confidence in the dollar and its reserve currency role, leading to instability. As we all know, this instability eventually ensured that the Europeans would not accept dollars of decreasing value, and they said, forget your dollars, give us gold instead. And gold flowed out of the US system at such a high rate that barely 3 years were to pass between European currencies becoming convertible and the US discovering it did not have enough gold to run the system. So already by 1961, the United States had to organize a gold pool in order to prop up, in order to back the dollar. And it tried expedient after expedient over the next decade, but within a decade it was very clear that the gold backing could not work. The United States had to throw in the towel and say we can no longer exchange dollars for gold. And when many European countries were trying to see if they could try to have a new kind of international monetary system, the sort that Keynes had proposed at Bretton Woods. So the dollar is essentially functioning as the world's money without any gold backing. This did not save it from the Triffin dilemma. By the end of the 1970s, that gold was worth about $800 an ounce, which would be close to about $3,000 in today's money. And these deficits were, of course, due to military expenditures and deteriorating trade position. This ended the first phase of the dollar system. But what has happened since is essentially the United States authorities have organized massive increases in dollar-denominated financial activity. What does that do? You may not need the dollar, countries may not need the dollar for trade or investment purposes, but private investors are invited, which includes banks and so on, are invited to essentially hold their money in the dollar system, to engage and to profit from the activities of the dollar system. And these activities are of two types. Number one, predatory lending, not for productive purposes, predatory lending. And number two, speculation. So what are the main ones? 1970s dollar-denominated lending spree by US investing financial institutions lending to third world countries without any check, because they needed to make money on the vast quantities of money that were being deposited in the US dollars, in the US banks and Western banks by OPEC countries. They had to lend, they went off lending, and eventually there was a third world debt crisis. In the 1980s, the Japanese lent to the United States, which of course eventually sent the dollar so high that you had to, which was completely unsustainable, and the Plaza Accord had to bring the dollar down. The 1990s Clinton administration facilitated a drive to open capital accounts everywhere, leading to systematically to currency crises beyond the US in many European countries, Latin American countries, Russia, Sweden, you name it, and eventually you had the big 1997-1998 East Asian financial crisis. It was followed very quickly by the bursting of the dot-com bubble, which had been inflating throughout the mid to late 1990s. That was then followed by the inflation of the housing and credit bubble, which ended in, people call it the events of 2008, a global financial crisis. It was no such thing, it was a North Atlantic financial crisis, because the bulk of the money that went to these toxic securities at that time was what came, beyond the UK and the US. It came from European financial institutions, which is why also they suffered the most. That this laid the foundation of the 2010 Euro crisis, but we won't go into that. And today, after 2008, the era of easy monetary policy, low or zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing, etc., has actually led to what some people are calling the everything bubble. Practically every asset market is going nowhere but up, because simply there is so much money sloshing about the system that they have to find some assets to invest in. And how unhealthy this is, you will see by the fact that while the asset markets are going this way, every economic indicator of the productive economy is going in the opposite direction. This is a completely unsustainable situation. And this, by the way, the everything bubble was inflated, and the everything bust has also started over the last many years. A number of asset markets are deeply in trouble. Commercial real estate is only the latest, but there is private equity, there is many other assets, and US Treasury market has softened. So, since 1971, these financializations have been the problem. So essentially, even when it seemed to work after a fashion, say up to about the early 2000s, the US financial system was riddled with many problems. It required a very high degree of financialization, drawing money away from productive investment, both in the United States and elsewhere. Secondly, it undermined the productive economy, direct consequence of the first. Thirdly, it led to even more volatility and recurring financial crisis, including for many third world countries, currency crisis, because their currencies would go up in value every time US investors decided that they wanted to bring money into Turkey or India or where have you. And then suddenly the US Federal Reserve, for example, raised interest rates, all this money would drain out, leaving a currency crisis for these countries for reasons that had nothing to do with the health of the country's economy. Completely extraneous. So you cannot really manage an economy for development under these circumstances. And today, of course, we are seeing, now we are in a position to see the long and enduring problems with the regular financial crisis. There is systematic undervaluation of other currencies. And this is an issue, by the way, which does not get the attention it deserves, because the flip side of the overvaluation of the dollar, which occurs because all these rich people around the world, whose governments allow them to have free capital flows, pile their money into the dollar system. What is the flip side of that? It is the devaluation of the currencies of their own countries. What is the result of that? People of those countries need to work longer and harder to earn the hard currency that they need. Their labor and their products are devalued as a result. This is a scandal which we must address. There are reverse capital flows. We are always told that the US runs a wonderful financial system which allocates capital to where it is needed. Obviously, the third world is the place where it is needed the most. Most of the capital is going in the other direction, from third world countries to first world countries. And finally, I should say, last but not least, this system has led to wars. Several wars of recent times, from Libya to Iraq, have been at least partly a result of the fact that the rulers of these countries were exploring ways of leaving the dollar system, which they knew was not in the interest of the countries which they were leading. So what has been happening since 2008? Since 2008, essentially, for all the talk of how they are going to regulate the financial system, after having bailed out the too big to fail and the too big to jail and so on, all these people who created the financial crisis, they got bailed out. People in the United States and the world were promised that there would be strict financial regulation. There has been nothing of the sort. Essentially, the Federal Reserve and other central banks have created the conditions for these institutions to continue in the same way as before, which is why we have today the everything bubble. But the contradictions of the dollar system are mounting. We were told, for example, often that the United States can afford to run deficits, etc., because it has a positive international investment position. That is to say, it invests more abroad than the rest of the world invests in the United States. But the United States' international investment position has been declining for a long time. Furthermore, as I pointed out, the 2008 crisis was not a global financial crisis, but a North Atlantic financial crisis. Up to that point, European financial institutions have been avidly putting money into the US financial system, but as we say in English, once bitten, twice shy. Having been really badly burned once, they are not going to go back into that. Now, the US Federal Reserve has of course supported swooning asset markets. It has done so because they have to. They have to support them if they want everybody to think that the US is a great place to come and speculate in asset markets and make money. So they have been supporting it with low or zero interest rate policies, quantitative easing, and lax financial regulation, and also this. This is the US Federal Reserve balance sheet. The Federal Reserve balance sheet was at about $1 trillion right up until the 2008 financial crisis. Then it went from 1 to a little over $2 trillion. Then it kind of remained there, but with quantitative easing and whatnot, it rose to about $4 trillion. Then in recent times with the pandemic and the vast, the tsunami of liquidity which the Federal Reserve has visited upon the system, it went to nearly $9 trillion. And given how soft the treasury market is, the Federal Reserve is going to have to buy more of these reserves. So in these ways, the Federal Reserve has supported swooning asset markets. But now, as I've already said, the return of inflation, which is itself a result of its unproductive predatory economy, decline of imperial power, is putting the Federal Reserve on the horns of a dilemma. The US will not opt to tackle inflation in the best possible way, which is to improve supply, to essentially say if the private sector will not supply the things that are needed, whose prices are going up, we will have public enterprise doing that. But this would be too much like socialism. You can't have that. And as I say, the removal of the debt ceiling has itself resolved the political crisis, but it has laid the foundation of a new debt crisis. And stories like this are multiplying. They are appearing in the mainstream financial press where people are saying that the treasury market is not doing well. People are not buying treasuries. The treasury market does not have the depth and the breadth, etc. What is the US going to do? But this is interesting as well, people, the discourse that is generated by Western institutions and so on, they lead you to believe that China and Japan are essentially holding up the US treasury market. The bulk of US debt is held by US entities and institutions, not by China or or Japan or any other country. So essentially what we are looking at is a situation in which the financial crisis, the bursting of the everything bubble is already underway. There are any number of triggers. They can be economic, financial, social, political, geopolitical that can trigger a knockdown crisis. And this knockdown crisis is going to very seriously set back the dollar. Why is it that people don't understand this? Because we have an academic industry based primarily in the United States, headed by people like Charles Kindleberger and his modern-day successors, who continue to talk up the dollar. The hegemony literature's very function has been to naturalize the idea of the currency of one country, a dominant country serving as the world's currency. And every setback the dollar has, they produce some new justification as to why this isn't a setback at all. Everything and its contrary is taken as a sign of US dollar strength. If the US dollar is strong, they say, oh, well, look how strong the US dollar is. If it weakens, they say, oh, look, the US dollar is weak, but everybody still wants the US dollar. So this is the kind of discourse. The Triffin dilemma, it is like they have an omerta, the old Sicilian pledge among families. You will not talk about certain things. They will never talk about the Triffin dilemma. Instead, they say the dollar, if worse come to worse, they say, well, the dollar is not doing well, but who is going to replace it? They say there is no successor, so the dollar will continue. But as we will see in a minute, there doesn't need to be a successor. In fact, there should not be a successor. So, and of course, they also say that RMB, can the RMB be a successor? They say, but the Chinese authorities are unable and unwilling to internationalize the renminbi. RMB is being internationalized, that's fine, and it will be internationalized. I have no doubt it will play a very important role, but it should not be internationalized on the pattern of the US dollar. If it is, China will essentially suffer the same consequences as Britain and the United States have suffered vis-a-vis their productive economies.